friends, fellow Earthlings, and explorers of the unknown, and welcome to Ask An Astrobiologist, the show that celebrates the science and the scientists involved in our quest to understand the nature of life. I'm your host, Dr. Graham, the cosmobiologist Lau, and as always, we're brought to you by the NASA Astrobiology Program and SaganNet.org. A huge thanks to all of you out there in the internet realm who share our show online on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn and all of the other cool places where you can share about cool science online. As always, we want to give a shout out to one profile that's been very active in sharing about our show, asking questions about our guest for this month's show. This month, we want to highlight the user at AstroBioBuzz on Twitter. This account's been fairly active lately in sharing and talking about astrobiology topics. And so a huge thank you to AstroBioBuzz on Twitter for sharing about Ask an Astrobiologist, engaging with me, with our guests. It's a pleasure to have all of you tuning in for our show every month. Now, today's episode is going to be pretty remarkable. I've been wanting to have today's guest on the show for quite some time, so I'm glad we could finally snag just a little bit of her time to have her chat with us. Today's guest is Dr. Lena Vincent. She is an experimental astrobiologist who earned her PhD in astrobiology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she was studying the chemical origins of life. She was also a fellow of the Future Investigators in NASA Earth and Space Science and Technology, or the FINEST program. After finishing her PhD, she then went on to become a NASA postdoctoral fellow at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL. At JPL, she studies how signs of life might be preserved in the icy ocean worlds of our solar system, like Europa and Enceladus, and how we can use instrumentation here on Earth and in the future on astrobiologically focused missions in space to look for those possible signs of life or biosignatures. She's also an avid science communicator and has garnered over 500,000 followers across social media in sharing about her life, her interests, and a whole lot of astrobiology. She's also into some really cool things like scuba diving and chasing aurorae, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, Lena Vincent, thank you so much for joining us for Ask an Astrobiologist.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you.
Awesome. Like I said, I've been wanting you on the show for a long time. We've been following each other in the internet realm for a while in social media. It's been very cool to see your growth as a science communicator, as well as a really great researcher in astrobiology. Before we jump into your research background, though, and what you're currently working on, one thing I love to ask of our guests is what got you interested in science, in astrobiology, in the realm that you've been pursuing in your life? What was your science origin story?
Well, it actually is a little bit surprising. I did not know that I wanted to be a scientist until a little bit later on in my childhood. So I was not one of those kids that you looked at and went, oh, she's going to be a scientist for sure. In fact, I went a lot of my childhood thinking I couldn't be a scientist because I wasn't very good at math. So I always really struggled with math when I was in middle school and high school. And because of that, I was kind of deterred away from doing science. Fortunately, I didn't really listen. I sort of fell in love with science through marine biology, interestingly. So I got to participate in an internship when I was in high school, approaching college application time. And I got to do some marine biology experiments with the Shed Aquarium. And that's what sold me on doing science. So I pursued a degree initially in marine biology at Cal State Long Beach. Then I switched over to general biology because I realized through my coursework that I just love biology in general. And I kind of stuck with that course until pretty late in my undergrad, actually as a postdoc. I was doing some research at City of Hope Medical Center out here in California and thinking about grad school and what I wanted to do and realizing that there was a whole world out there of different things that I could study. And I happened across the NASA Astrobiology Institute website, incidentally, and my world was just rocked. I had no idea that astrobiology was a thing, and there it was, this website. And not only did astrobiology exist, NASA was excited about it. And so I haven't looked back since. I decided right then and there that's what I wanted to do, and that's how I discovered astrobiology, kind of by accident through a Google search.
I love it so much. And honestly, marine biology is like a gateway science for so many people. I also loved marine biology. I was an intern at the Graduate School of Oceanography. I often talk to other people who've pursued various realms of astrobiology who started off in that realm. And so maybe in some ways wanting to know what the alien life of our own oceans is like kind of leads us towards some of those ideas. But then in your graduate studies, you were studying more in the origins of life, the chemical origins of life. Can you explain to us a bit more about your graduate research and what you were pursuing and trying to understand how life begins?
Yeah, so I was very lucky to be part of a super exciting project that started right when I started my PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My advisor was a botanist named David Baum, who had just secured funding from a program run by NASA and the NSF to do high-risk science for solving the origin of life, or at least part of the mystery of the origin of life. And so that was super exciting. And basically, my role in my PhD was testing out an experimental procedure to validate a model that they'd come up with for the origin of life. And that model was pretty simple. It was that you could get the processes of life, things like the ability to grow and reproduce and evolve, in systems of chemicals in the absence of life. And so we had a whole sort of scenario for how that might happen that involved mineral surfaces and mixing those with chemicals, and then eventually getting these kind of self-perpetuating, evolving chemical networks, which is very cool and very risky. It's basically just mixing a whole bunch of stuff together in a test tube and then looking for these lifelike processes. And so that was the bulk of my PhD was developing that procedure and then implementing it to look for signs of these lifelike chemical systems, as we call them, to understand how life originated, which we are still clueless about at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't know if life started on Earth or elsewhere and came here. We don't know the process. And maybe evolution itself was just throwing a bunch of stuff together and seeing what happened. So that's really exciting. I will say, I don't know exactly when you and I first interacted online or in life, but I do remember you kind of helping to put together and lead the Ulala Symposium at UW-Madison. I wonder if you can explain for our audience what that is, and your role in developing that symposium for bringing together astrobiologists to talk about their research.
Yeah, so while I was at UW-Madison, I took advantage of a grant program that was at the university to fund outreach programs, specifically to highlight women in STEM. And so I applied for the grant, and I thought it would be a great opportunity not only to bring attention to astrobiology on the UW-Madison campus, which was still relatively unknown at the time. It was pretty small. We only had, I believe, one or two kind of research efforts at UW-Madison in astrobiology, but also highlight some women in the field who I thought were doing absolutely incredible work. So we got funding to bring 4 scientists to campus, kind of across different disciplines under the umbrella of astrobiology, who came to give talks to the public, but then also interact with various departments at UW-Madison, just to bring exposure to the field and let people know, let students know in particular, hey, this is something you can do. This is an area of science that a lot of people aren't aware of, and it's really exciting. And if it's something that interests you, here are examples of scientists who are doing some really groundbreaking work in that area. So that kind of launched the Ulala initiative at UW-Madison, which was an extension of that, where we sort of consolidated all of the astrobiology research that was happening on the campus, which was growing and as it continues to grow on the campus, and also do outreach and spread the word beyond just the walls of UW-Madison about the work that's being done there.
I love that so much. And it's so important for representation, for inclusion, for people to see people who look like them from various realms, including lots of the amazing women who are doing incredible things throughout astrobiology and all the sciences involved in our quest to understand life. And I definitely want to come back to science communication in just a minute and using social media, for instance, to share science. But first, I want to talk about your current research. You are now at JPL, which might be like the mecca of space exploration for a lot of people. It's a pretty cool place. I wonder if you can just share with our audience your current research at JPL and what it's like being a NASA postdoc.
Yeah, it is super exciting. It's always been my dream to be at JPL. And so it's still kind of surreal for me to be there. But yeah, I am part of a really amazing, diverse team that in general, our goal is, if we project into the future, that we're able to send a spacecraft to the outer solar system, to one of the icy moons, say Europa, a moon of Jupiter's, or Enceladus, a moon of Saturn's. And we can land there and reach the surface, maybe go a little bit below the surface, and look for signs of life there. How would we do that? If there are signs of life on these icy moons on the surface, what kinds of instruments would we need to send up there, and what would they need to do? What would they need to look for as definitive signs of life? And so the way we're trying to answer that question is by simulating aspects of those environments. So we know that they're very, very harsh in a lot of ways. So they're very cold, first of all. But they also are exposed to various kinds of radiation and lots of it. And we know that biology, right, the structures of biology really don't do well in those environments. And so the question is, if those exist there, would they be detectable? Will they be altered by the radiation? And is that something we need to take into consideration when we're designing these missions? And so, recreating those aspects in a laboratory is super important. So we have a variety of vacuum chambers with different radiation sources, including electrons, ultraviolet light. And we basically blast various things, including whole cells, with that radiation at various temperatures and look at what comes out the other end to make sure that we're able to detect them. And so, that's basically what we do. We just blast stuff with radiation and then do a whole bunch of chemical analysis to figure out what kinds of biosignatures we should be targeting.
Very cool. In my own research in the past, I had a chance to go to Borup Fjord Pass in the high Arctic to a site where fluid is moving through a glacier and depositing material on the surface, providing for us a way to see how biosignatures are preserved on the surface of a cold environment. We have similar environments in Antarctica with Blood Falls in the Taylor Valley. There's a lot of cool environments around the Earth that we can look at, but I wonder if you can just share with our audience how different the environments are at the near surface of Europa and Enceladus compared to the things that we find here on Earth.
Yeah, so those are great analog sites, and there are lots of them. But I think the big difference probably, there are a lot of differences, the Earth and these moons are different in other ways, both in size and where they are in the solar system and all that. But I think the radiation is the big thing. Jupiter, that Europa orbits is producing a lot of ionizing radiation. So these really high energy particles that basically just punch through biological molecules and create a lot of damage. There are some forms of ionizing radiation that affect us here on Earth, but the story is very different around Jupiter. And so any life that existed there would have to contend with this very aggressive, very strong form of radiation. And so that's one huge difference. The other big difference that also plays into this is the presence of an atmosphere. So Earth, here we have an atmosphere, which, among other things, does protect us quite a bit from radiation. That is not the case on the surface of Europa and Enceladus. It may have a very, very thin, what we call exosphere, but it's very marginal and it doesn't do much in the way of protecting. So those are the big differences, and they do matter a lot when we're thinking about biosignatures and how well they would be preserved in those environments when they're dealing with these really, really aggressive forms of radiation.
Absolutely. And that's a great segue to the poll that we put out yesterday for our audience. We asked people what might be the biggest challenge in their own view for finding signs of life at or near the surface of a world like Europa. We gave them the options of freezing temperatures, of the high radiation or a lot of salt in that environment, the very low pressure or low water activity. And more than half of the respondents did say that it was radiation that they thought would be the biggest issue. The next largest, almost 25% of those respondents said the freezing temperatures were an issue for finding possible signs of life. And maybe they were even talking about active life. And I think we should differentiate. We're not looking necessarily just for active cells at the surface of Europa, but looking for signs of life's activity, past or present. And so that's kind of interesting. We did have one person respond too that they weren't aware that these were possible issues. And so it's really important, I think, to share that these are very different environments for us to explore. Now, you've mentioned you're using these test chambers to kind of recreate the biology, recreate the biosignatures we could look for. What kinds of biosignatures are you looking at right now? Or are you throwing in like active live organisms and then seeing how they might produce signatures in that environment?
Yeah, so the answer is all of the above. So we're sort of casting a pretty wide net. So obviously one of the things we're looking for are the stuff of life, right? The molecules of life. So what we call chemical biosignatures. If there were an organism at the surface that's bombarded by radiation, maybe it wouldn't be alive, but it might leave behind traces of its presence that we can go in and detect after some time. So we are looking at those. So we're looking at different types of macromolecules. So for example, amino acids, lipids, nucleic acids, so all the things that cells tend to be made of, we are targeting. We are also looking at cells themselves. And that is a big part of the work that I'm doing right now is not just these chemical biosignatures, but actually the cells themselves. Do those provide a protective effect. Are we more likely to detect whole cells than we are these chemical biosignatures, which might be much more sensitive by themselves? So we're kind of looking at both whole cells and then also the chemical biosignatures they produce.
Oh, that's so cool. I will say, so a chemist, Dr. Ian Miller, reached out to me on Facebook earlier today, and he argued that it's not possible for life to start in Europa or Enceladus in ocean worlds. We've heard this argument from others. There are some who've been on the show even who have the hot spring hypothesis, for instance, suggesting life had to start on a dry environment here on Earth. One of the arguments for there not being potential life on Europa or Enceladus has been a lack of phosphorus, or at least what we thought was a lack of phosphorus. A paper just came out today and was shared by the NASA Astrobio Twitter account where they found signs of phosphorus salts in the E-ring around Saturn coming from Enceladus. And so I guess just for a fun personal question for you, do you think Europa or Enceladus is more likely the better target to go to right now for us to look for possible signs of life, especially now that we have evidence that there is phosphorus in the Enceladus, the Saturn E-ring?
Well, so I have an answer, but it's not based on whether or not I think life is more likely to arise on one or the other, because I have a blanket answer for that, and that's that we have no idea what life needs. Even here on Earth, it's impossible right now for us to disentangle that history and say with certainty, life can only develop with this kind of environment, with these specific things. That is just not, we're just not in that place, and there's good reason to think we'll never be in that position. On the other hand, we can say, maybe life can arise in lots of different places as long as it has a bare minimum. So I'm going to be optimistic and say that life could arise anywhere that has the right ingredients. And right now, it seems like both Europa and Enceladus do. So let's say that that's even chances on both. I would put my money on Enceladus right now, only because looking at the structure of these moons and their interiors, we think that if life exists, it probably does well below the surface. Far below where we're able to access, right? So we're talking about drilling through kilometers of ice, and that's just not something we're able to do technologically right now. The nice thing with Enceladus, we know sort of for sure, is that there are mechanisms by which material from the subsurface come up to the surface through these kind of geyser-like mechanisms. That may also be the case with Europa, still figuring that out. Clipper next year in a few years, will help us figure that out. But just because we know that there is this mechanism by which stuff from the subsurface comes up, we might have a better chance of sampling that material and therefore detecting signs of life if they exist. So I'm going to put my money on Enceladus, but not because I think it has a better chance of having life than Europa, because I think we have a better chance at detecting it.
I love that. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, Enceladus is just spewing possible biosignatures into space for us to go fly through and look at. We need another mission, and soon. I do want to change gears a little bit now to talk about your presence on social media and all of the communication that you've done. You've grown a rather large following across many different social media platforms. Your user handles are at AstroBioLena for those who want to follow you in various places. What was the structure for you to kind of get engaged? What drove you to share so much science through social media?
Yeah, so I actually didn't start through social media. So, the first few years of my PhD, I did a lot of outreach and science communication through what I would call more traditional platforms, right? So in person, speaking to the public, schools, churches, retirement homes. And the jump to social media really didn't come until after the start of the pandemic, when we saw some of these new platforms arise. People were turning to social media for a lot of entertainment. I was part of that group. And actually, a year or so into it, so say in the summer of 2021, I kind of happened across this whole new realm of social media, which was education, right? Education on social media, sharing educational content, whether that's SciComm or something else, balancing a budget, using a Lightroom or some kind of software. And it really hadn't clicked to me that social media could be used effectively for SciComm until then. And so I kind of, on a whim, threw my hat in. I created a video. Actually, it had nothing to do with science at the time. It was how to use PowerPoint to make a good presentation. And that kind of blew up, and I rode that wave for a little bit. And then when that sort of came to an end, I was like, I wonder if people would be interested in my science, in astrobiology. And I didn't know of a lot of people doing astrobiology, SciComm in that realm, specifically on things like TikTok and Instagram Reels. And so, I kind of capitalized on that, made some videos, and sort of took off from there. So that was my entry into SciComm on social media.
I love it so much. Now, in the realm of science communication, for those of us who have continued pursuing our research careers while also sharing science, we do have that issue sometimes that we butt up against, of especially amongst traditional academics, is this idea that if you're sharing science actively and you're pursuing that role, that you can't be a good researcher at the same time. And sometimes it's referred to as the Sagan Effect. There were a lot of people who felt like Carl Sagan, putting so much time into writing books and producing Cosmos, wasn't also doing effective and good research. Have you noticed that kind of dichotomy that some people have viewed that you're doing good science communication, so you can't be a good researcher? And if so, how have you kind of dealt with that struggle?
I have, and I also point out that there is the opposite problem. So I am a scientist, but I have a lot of colleagues and SciCommers who are not career scientists, and they also receive a lot of criticism saying, they're not scientists, so how could they possibly, be respected in SciComm and deliver effective SciComm? And I think all of that is not true, right? I think I do encounter the opposite, right? The fact that doing so much SciComm and being so active with the public means that that's taking away somehow from my abilities as a career scientist. And I've just not found that to be the case. Certainly in terms of time and effort, right? You have to make time. There has to be time to do both of those things. And that is a bit of a balancing act. But I would argue that we have that balancing act regardless of whether or not we do SciComm, right? Balancing life and the work is a challenge that's pretty universal. But yeah, I think as long as you can find the time and it's appropriate and it's balanced, I really don't see how they're mutually exclusive. In fact, I've found in my experience that both of those things, right, my career as a SciCommer and as a scientist have mutually benefited from each other and have really made me better in both of those cases. So I do definitely encounter that, but I think that's starting to wane a little bit as people really see the value of SciComm and the value of having actual career scientists contribute. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I personally, I've noticed a lot more amongst, younger, upcoming early career researchers tend to see more of the value than we traditionally have in sharing our science more openly and doing more community engagement and being part of their community and sharing. And I love the idea of your science communication kind of improving your science. It's just like, reading a really good article and then talking about it with somebody else is a great way to understand that research. And if you're talking about it with, 500,000 people, that's a much different way to talk about the research. I do want to jump into a few things you've been sharing lately of your interest. But before I get there, just a reminder for our audience watching live, you can ask your questions right now in the chat on YouTube for Dr. Vincent, and we will get to those questions very soon, I promise. But there are a few more things I want to know about. First off, of late, Lena, you've been sharing a lot of really cool stuff about scuba diving. I've been kind of nerding out as a diver and someone who loves the ocean world, especially marine life, over all of these incredible videos. I wonder if you can just share your journey as a diver and all these incredible things you've been doing with us.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about it. So it's a fairly new venture for me. So it's funny, but it's also kind of coming full circle because, as I mentioned, I got my interest in science through the ocean, through marine biology. So it's been really fun to kind of close that loop and come back to it. So scuba is always something I wanted to try, but either just didn't have the time or was a little bit apprehensive about because it is kind of scary, or just didn't have the funds because it is also a pretty expensive hobby, turns out. But last year in October, I decided to go for it. I'm here in California now. There's great diving out here. Got certified kind of as a thing I thought I'd do as a hobby on vacation sometimes. And yeah, I was wrong about that. I fell completely in love and realized that there's a whole world of diving that incorporates science, right? So there's scientific diving. This is something I was not aware of until fairly recently. So you can actually get certified to do science and contribute to research projects underwater with scuba. And so now that I know that exists, I'm looking for ways to kind of meld my skills as a scientist and as a diver. And so I think diving is very quickly become a big, important part of my life. But even just as a hobby, I look for any opportunities to dive. Anywhere I travel is kind of right on the top of my list is look for a place to scuba. And that's been super fun. So yeah, definitely if anyone's thought about trying it and isn't sure, you should try it.
I love it. Yeah, absolutely. It's so incredible. And there are different pursuits in diving that people can go after, like cave diving and other aspects of technical diving, wreck diving, all kinds of cool things that you can do if you're interested and you're okay with tight spaces for some of those. I will say, so many NASA astronauts, to my knowledge, all NASA astronauts have been certified to be divers. that underwater environment is important for those who need to experience kind of not neutral buoyancy, but also kind of a more, extreme environment, where it's a little bit more scary. It kind of pushes the human body to a limit. You are forced to rely on an apparatus like scuba. And I wonder for you, in your own thinking of like training for astrobiology for the future, do you think it'll be helpful for young people who want to be astrobiologists to experience the underwater environment? Will that help them think more about possible alien environments?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned, right, this neutral buoyancy, first of all, I think it's just such a unique experience that you really don't get to do unless you go up into space, right? And so I think just being down there and really kind of pushing the limits of where we can go as human beings, right, with the assistance of these kind of external gas sources, I think absolutely puts things in perspective. And certainly for astrobiologists that are sort of exploring the limits of life and how weird it can get, the underwater world is a perfect example of that, and is a perfect opportunity to reflect on that and really be inspired by the weirdness of underwater creatures. So yeah, I think there's absolutely benefits for people who are considering astrobiology, but I think just in general as a person, right, as a human being, just kind of getting outside of our comfort zone, which tends to be on dry land, can be super beneficial, and I highly recommend it.
Awesome. I love it so much. One more question then from me before we go to our faster than light segment. You also, in your own social media, your life, you've been chasing aurorae. You've been watching storms. Actually, I know that if there is a solar storm, there's a good chance you're going to post about it on Twitter, and I can follow along and see what's going on. I wonder if you can speak to, like, what is your interest? What's your fascination with space weather that's driven you to chase some aurorae?
Yeah, I actually don't really know where it started. I think I've always been really interested in weather in general, so severe weather. So, I haven't lived in a lot of places where we have severe weather, things like tornadoes and big, severe thunderstorms, but I've always been fascinated by them. I love clouds. I love the kind of impending doom aspect of it. I don't know what it is. I love watching storm chasing shows. And I've kind of made a hobby out of tracking those severe weather systems, even if they have nothing to do with me geographically. And I think that sort of spiraled into just space weather. This amazing phenomenon we have here on Earth of the aurora, these beautiful light displays that we have, and the fact that they originate from the sun and interact with our magnetic field, I think is so elegant and so cool and so beautiful. And I've gotten to see the aurora now a few times. I actually went to Alaska last year as a post-graduation trip for myself and got to experience them in a way I hadn't before. And again, another thing I would recommend for people if they have the opportunity to go witness, because it is really life-changing. But yeah, that's where my interest in them came from.
I love it so much. Yeah, it's so cool. Just that connection. I love that you pointed out this is connecting us to our star in our own solar system. And it's always fun. I think one of the best things of exploring astrobiology and space science is becoming aware of how connected we really are to everything. And so thank you so much for sharing all of that. I do want to get to our audience questions, but first we have our faster than light segment. So really short answers, kind of just some fun questions that we like to ask of everyone. The first one comes directly from me because I nerd out over it with this idea of the Fermi question or Fermi Paradox. So for you, Dr. Lena Vincent, what is your favorite answer to Fermi's question, where are they?
Ooh, well, there are a lot of potential answers, but the ones I tend to favor are the ones that really highlight how little we know. And that oftentimes we might be looking for the wrong thing and in the wrong place. So there are a number of different ideas about the fact that, these civilizations, these alien civilizations, if they exist, might very well be transmitting. They might exist. They might be trying to make connections with us, but we are not looking at the right thing. We tend to be looking for radio signals. Maybe they're using something else, whether that's neutrinos, lasers, or something completely different that we just cannot conceptualize right now because we know so little about everything, let alone other civilizations if they exist. So that tends to be my favorite answer, is we have no idea what to look for.
I love it so much. That makes me think of like gravitational waves and like more kind of out there physics concepts and cosmology and how aliens might be like shifting around neutron stars and sending messages. There's so many things that could be happening out there. And so for myself, I'm a huge fan of science fiction. I've always nerded out over Star Trek, Star Wars. I wonder for you, what stories have inspired you to want to know more about the nature of the universe?
So definitely science fiction. I am a huge science fiction nerd. If you could see the books in my bookcase, you'd see about 90% of them are sci-fi. So I definitely get a lot of inspiration there. I think it's been such a powerful tool for imagining just how weird life can get. That's really kind of the only tool that we have right now that allows us to kind of envision fully what life might be like elsewhere. One that I just recently reread, that's one of my favorites, is a short story called Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, which inspired the movie Arrival, which is also a fantastic film. It's an even better short story, in my opinion. So definitely sci-fi, but also, like we were talking about earlier, the ocean and how weird life can get. I think just pushing the limits, the boundaries of what we think is possible in terms of shape and physiology, and how weird things can get really inspires me to think about how weird they could get elsewhere. So yeah, life on Earth.
I love it. I actually just finished Stories of Your Life and Others last night for the second time. It's a great short story collection. He has a new short story collection out that I have not read yet, so I need to jump over to that next, I think. So right now where you are in your career, I mean, you're very successful. You're now a postdoc at JPL doing remarkable research. You've had some different research along the way. You mentioned that you started off kind of interested in marine biology, but I wonder if you could go back to the beginning of your collegiate career, your academic career, and give yourself some advice, what would you say?
I would say that being an expert in one specific thing is overrated. Obviously having experts and expertise is super important, but at least in terms of being something to strive for, I've really learned that there are much more important things. I used to have this vision that to be successful and to be valued by the world was, to be that expert in that one thing, that people bring into a courtroom, or, you're really the one person who can comment on something. And I think that's great. But I think for me personally, I've found much more value in pursuing things like enjoying the work, right? Having fun with it, working with great people, and also having the opportunity to change expertise sometimes. And that's something I've done a lot in my career. I've become an expert in one thing and then I move on to something else that interests me. And I think, while again, having expertise in one specific thing, super valuable, and we need those people, it's also totally okay and important to recognize that interest shift, and you can do something else if you want to.
I love that. And that's very much in the vein of this next question then, of changing things if you want to, or what could happen for any of us. What is something that excites you about the future?
Oh, I think pretty simple. I'm just excited about learning more about the place that we live in, specifically the solar system, right? Obviously, there's so many discoveries and things we need to learn about Earth. And some of that might come through exploring other worlds. So we have really exciting missions to places like Venus, our other next door neighbor, that we really know almost nothing about. And I think is pretty shameful when you think about it. And so I'm really excited to see what we're going to learn from places like Venus and what they can tell us about our own history and where we're going. And then obviously just reaching further out into the solar system, seeing what these other worlds are about. So we got, Dragonfly to Titan, Europa Clipper that's launching next year is being built right here at JPL. So yeah, I'm just really excited about those.
I love it so much. Yeah, I'm excited for those missions. I'm excited for what the future has for all of us to learn about our place together as a civilization. Now, you're doing such remarkable work at JPL. You get to play with these mini icy world chambers you've developed, and you're putting stuff inside to see what happens and testing the instrumentation we'll take to space with us. But what is the best part of your job?
I would say probably the people I get to work with. I think that's such an important part of every job, right? It's not just the work that we're doing and the specific research that we get to do. And I'm very lucky in that both of those things are so great for me and align very much with what I want to do. And I love my job and I love what I research. But I think without having a really solid team of people that you trust and that you can interact with on a daily basis and defer to, right? We tend to be experts in lots of different things. None of it really works, right? And so I think I'm very lucky that here at JPL, I work with an incredible team of people who are all not only friendly and kind and great human beings, but also do such cool science and are excited about so many different things. And so I think that's the best part, is just being excited with really cool people about really exciting things.
Awesome. I love it so much. So the last question from our Faster Than Light round, and this is my favorite of them all. What is an unbelievable science fact that still blows your mind?
Okay, and there are obviously so many, but I think one that confronts me pretty much every night, at least every clear night, is the number of exoplanets out there. So you look at the night sky on a clear night when you can see stars, and your mind is already crumbling at the thought of how many stars are out there. But the fact that we think that for at least every planet you see, there's at least one exoplanet. So for all the stars you're seeing, there might be this just flood of exoplanets that you can't see. Is just, not only is it cool, I can't wrap my brain around it. And every night I try to sit up at the sky and say, they're out there. And I just can't accept it because I can't see them. So not only is it unbelievable, it's also just hard to wrap your head around.
Very cool. I love it. Yeah, there are so many remarkable things to know about our universe and our place in it. And we're still just barely touching the tip of an iceberg of knowledge that's available out there. I will now jump to our audience questions. I see that we actually have had a bunch of them come in. So thank you to all of you watching live and those who've asked questions online using the hashtag AskAstrobio. The first question comes from Tom Caruso, who's user Rendering Reality 3D Animations on YouTube. They want to know if you can discuss changes in seawater chemistry on Earth over time and how that compares to what we currently know about the icy ocean worlds of our solar system.
Well, it's maybe going to be sort of an unsatisfying answer, but we don't know very much. So we do know that the chemistry of the ocean has changed significantly over time in different parameters, both its oxygenation level, which is super important. So we know that deep in its past, there was little to no atmospheric oxygen. And that, of course, affected the chemistry of the ocean itself. We know that the kinds of things that were dissolved in the ocean were really different as well. The types of metals that were present, its temperature, its pH. So pretty much everything about the ocean has changed over time. The specifics of that evolution is still unclear, the timing of it. And there's a lot of work being done in astrobiology to figure that out, and also how that would affect biology, right? Obviously, all of those things really, really influence what's possible physiologically in terms of metabolism. So that's being worked on. There's also a huge amount of uncertainty about what the oceans of these ocean worlds are like. We have a tiny bit of information. That is the subject of some of these upcoming missions, is to try to get some clarity on that. But we really don't know very much. We know that they are mostly liquid water. They have stuff dissolved in them. They might be salty. And again, all those are things that are important for biology, but we are still, I would say, we have a lot of work to do to figure out what the specifics of those conditions are.
Yeah, absolutely. So much more to learn yet. Our next question comes from Jim Pass on Twitter at Astrosociology. And Jim is not asking a sociology question this time necessarily, which is interesting. So Jim wants to know if or when the search for intelligent extraterrestrial life is successful, do you think it'll be through detection of biosignatures, technosignatures, or some combination of both?
Wow, that's very hard to predict, I would say. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's still so much we don't understand in terms of, first of all, the distribution of life in the universe, whether it exists elsewhere, and what it will be like. I think it's very hard to make sort of probabilistic projections about where that detection will come from without knowing the specifics of what the life that is producing those signatures is going to be like. However, I would probably, just based on, making assumptions about the history of life on Earth, and, the fact that its history really was dominated by microbial life, simpler life that wasn't putting out, for example, sophisticated radio signals out into space. I'd probably focus on biosignatures. Again, just making very strong assumptions. You're making me pick something, so I would pick biosignatures just because of that. Just because, the moment in history, the kind of slice of history that we've been broadcasting radio signals for is relatively short. Compared to this history of Earth to begin with. So I would go with that. But it's a very, very arm-wavy, presumptuous answer.
Yeah, absolutely. We just don't know, right? I love it. So our next question actually comes from one of our production assistants, who's been a visiting scholar with me at Blue Marble Space Institute of Science. He was a past intern with me, and now he's starting his PhD work. This fall, he's coming to the U.S. in September to begin his PhD research at Northwestern University in Chicago. Anurup Mohanty, who I'm a big fan of, not just because I'm his advisor, have been a colleague now of his. I'm also excited to see where he takes his career. However, again, he's starting his PhD, so he wants to know what advice you might have for someone who's starting a PhD in research, but is also interested in science communication, how he might manage his time, and maybe what skills you think could be essential for him to excel as a researcher and science communicator.
That's a great question. I think just knowing that that is something that you want to do puts you at a great advantage, because it means that you can kind of hit the ground running in terms of letting people know that that's an interest that you have. So obviously, talking to your advisor and not just to make sure that that's going to be okay with them, because that is a big part of that, right? When you do a PhD, it's a big time commitment. And you want to make sure that that is something that your advisor and your mentors know about you and are okay with. I think most advisors are, and they recognize the value of SciComm, but also they can put you in front of opportunities to do that, right? So I was very lucky with my PhD advisor, knew that I was very interested in SciComm, and so would kind of pass on opportunities, to go speak at schools, at seminars. And so I think that's another really great reason to communicate that openly. And then I think, really learning how to balance both things, making time to dedicate to, your core skills, your core responsibilities as a grad student, but then also incorporating the SciComm aspect. So really learning how to balance the time that you have. And then trying, if you can, to incorporate the two. So one format of video that really was successful for me was actually bringing people into my day-to-day, right? Showing them what it's like to be a grad student. Because a lot of people don't know, right? Unless you're a grad student, unless you've been through the process, that's kind of a foreign thing. And people love that. People love seeing not only what it's like as a grad student, but also if you can take them into your lab and show them stuff that you're doing, even better. So I think those would be my big three things.
Very cool. Yeah, this balance is the most important thing I think you said there for me as well. Like it can be hard to find the appropriate balance for all of us, but balance is so crucial, not just for research and science communication, but all the things we do in our lives. So I love that so much. We have two very similar questions now. One from user A. Pachel on YouTube, who is doing some similar kinds of research, or at least interested in similar research with viruses, hydrothermal vents, origins of life. And they want to know about advice you might have for people who want to share that science. But we also have a similar question from another one of my interns at Blue Marble Space Institute of Science this summer. Sib Sankar Palit is working with me on biosignatures and doing some research in biosignatures. And Sib Sankar kind of has the same question. If you have any tips for people who are beginners and want to maybe improve themselves in sharing science, especially if doing so through social media and the internet.
Ooh, yeah. So I think the recommendations I have are pretty general, regardless of the specific subject that you want to communicate. So if you're doing it through social media, usually it's going to be very bite-sized, very, very, very small. We're talking about 60 seconds maximum if you're doing a video. And so really thinking about what you can deliver effectively in that 60 seconds. So it's usually one main point. And really, if your goal is to get as much reach as possible, it's to make it as accessible as possible. And really the way to do that, obviously the general things apply, not using too much jargon, especially if it's not explained, not assuming that people know about certain things beforehand. But I think one thing that's helped me is always thinking about why it matters, right? Why we care, try to make it relatable. And I think if you really go with that, you start with that, you really can't go wrong. So thinking not just about the technical information and making sure that's accurate. And I think as scientists, we tend to do that pretty well. But also like why it matters. Why do we care? What does this mean? If you can go with that, not only will it be really effective science communication, it'll also keep people engaged and actually want to watch what it is you produce, which really is the important thing. So lead with that. Lead with the relatability aspect.
Very cool. Yeah, I love that so much. The next question I might take first, and then I'll share. This is from user KZN on YouTube. They say they are a protein biophysics researcher interested in astrobiology and wanting to know how to combine the two, but not knowing where to start and what advice we might offer. I think I'll start off that by doing research in the physics and the biology of proteins. You are doing astrobiology already. Maybe you weren't aware of it, but astrobiology isn't a discipline. Astrobiology is a field that includes many disciplines. It includes chemistry, physics, biology, geology, oceanography, atmospheric chemistry, philosophy, cultural studies, sociology. All of these various realms of learning from human study have come together to help us understand how life might begin, where life might be out there, the evolutionary trajectories of life, and what the future of life might be, and how we search for other life. There's so much that we're learning with all these studies together. So I would argue that you actually are already doing astrobiology if you don't know it. But Dr. Vincent, maybe you could give them some advice on ways they could take some of their research in proteins and in biology and maybe expand outward into some more very, very directed astrobiology work.
Yeah, well, first, I would agree with you. I think when you think about it, almost any kind of research feeds into astrobiology somehow. And that's actually one of the main pieces of advice I give to people, especially when they're very early on, like not even in college yet. or thinking about joining their first research lab is to not sweat too hard whether or not it calls itself an astrobiology lab, because really any skill you gain in research will be helpful. And then it becomes a matter of finding opportunities that allow you to convert those skills and start asking questions about astrobiology, whether that's in a laboratory that, again, is self-proclaimed as an astrobiology lab or has interest, right, in exploring these things. So if your current advisor has an interest in figuring out how protein biophysics in, say, early ancestral proteins might have operated, pitch that to them. See if you have little grant opportunities locally or higher at the national level, right, with these bigger funding agencies to fund some of that work, or maybe find collaborators who work in that space. I can tell you that those people exist, absolutely. People are very interested in kind of early proteins and the protein evolution, and the biophysics of that definitely plays into it. But yeah, I think in general, thinking about next steps, I don't know where the person who asked this question is at in their career, but definitely you're in the right place, you're doing the right kind of work, and maybe for your next lab, start to think about whether that's work you want to continue kind of in a new context, or look for a different research lab that's doing something different that caters to another aspect of astrobiology that might be very different than proteins.
Very cool. I agree entirely. Our next question from user Haley Monaco on YouTube. They ask a rather fun question. They asked you if you expect to find extraterrestrial comb jellies in ocean worlds or on ocean moons. I kind of want to go a little bit further, though, if I can, Haley, if that's okay with your question. I'm working on an article right now about convergent evolution, things like trees and crabs and some other things that have converged biologically in metabolism for microbes and things like that in life. Are there any things that you specifically think, Dr. Vincent, life might have converged to, or is there something that you really want to find in extraterrestrial life out there?
Oh man, that's a loaded question. I think as soon as you start to bring in evolution, things get real messy. And actually, that was a big part of my PhD, is understanding not just the origin of evolution, but what evolution even is. And so as far as convergent evolution, right, the hope or the expectation that, life elsewhere might converge on similar kinds of adaptations, or at least structures, so that we might be able to detect them, I think is a big part of astrobiology, right? We do make that assumption often. We have to, right? Because we can't really imagine something else. It's really hard to look for something you can't even conceive of. But I think really the only thing I expect life to have converged on is the ability to evolve in the first place. That's really, when I think about it, I think that's really the only fair assumption we can make at this point, because evolution, at least even here on Earth, is really, it's not a predictable process, right? It's not something we can project forward. Even though we think we can, we really can't. It's a retrospective thing. And so I think even predicting, convergence is not really possible. And I think trying to do that in other environments is also really difficult. And I think really the only thing we really know for sure is that life elsewhere probably evolves, right? Because that's part of our definition of life. And so, yeah, I think that's going to be my kind of cop-out answer.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, there's so much we don't know. A user, Dale Douglas on YouTube, wanted to know if there is a consensus estimate amongst us in the astrobiology community as if when we're gonna find alien life. And the true answer to that is we don't know. Sometimes in my talks, I'll share in the past when certain people said, within this given time frame, we'll find alien life. So far, none of those predictions have been correct. However, I will say for myself, it feels like if we're not alone in our little corner of the galaxy, given our detections of exoplanets, and now we're monitoring their atmospheres with new telescopes and kind of exploring more of our own solar system, it feels like we might be close. I wonder if you have a feeling towards that at all, Dr. Vincent, whether or not we'd be close to finding alien life.
I feel the same way. We're certainly getting closer, right? We're closer than we've ever been, which again is a little bit of an unsatisfying answer, but I certainly think, to your point with exoplanets, but also some of the missions that we have coming up are starting to be really astrobiology focused. And I think it's important to remember that many of the exploration missions that we've sent to space so far have not been astrobiology focused, right? They're a very small minority. And so in the grand scheme of things, we really haven't looked. We really haven't looked very hard. And that's going to change, right? We have actual missions coming up that are astrobiology missions. And I think that's going to, that puts us in a really good spot if life does exist, say, at the subsurface of Mars or on Titan. I mean, I think that's unlikely, but who knows? It's a stretch. But I think we're getting closer, just because we are actually putting more effort into looking. And I think that's the first step. And hopefully we're going to continue to do that more and more. Not only do I hope that's the case, I kind of know that's the case, right? Like we know that's what's driving a lot of the work that we're doing as astrobiologists. So I'm optimistic as well. So yeah.
Awesome. I think we're going to have time maybe for one or two more questions. Anurup Mohanty dropped in another question. I know that he's a huge fan of yours, and so I'm not surprised he wants to know a lot of what you do. He does wonder how you stay on top of the literature, maybe more broadly, how you stay on top of your research, and how in the past for social media, how you've selected topics, for instance. Is that from things you've been actively reading, or is that from things you think your audience was interested in, or both?
Yeah, so staying on top of literature is really hard. And especially I think for us astrobiologists, we usually are tracking lots of different kinds of literature, right? Because we do have some astrobiology focused journals, but we're usually interested in pulling pieces from different fields, from other research areas. And that makes it really difficult. And so, it's definitely something I'm always striving to do better. But surprisingly, I find social media to be a very good way to do that. Twitter in particular. I feel like I've come across papers that are super relevant to my field, but also are just general interest to me because people have shared about them and written these little digestible threads on them. So I think that's been one kind of surprising consequence of being on science Twitter, is that you get kind of put in front of these papers that you might not otherwise come across through your own searches. And then I also, I'm a big fan of the Google Scholar notifications, right? I have a lot of keywords put in there. I get a lot of papers pushed to me. But then also, just scanning around. I'm interested in other things beyond astrobiology. And so I kind of peruse different journals and different SciComm channels who put me onto papers that I might be interested in. And also people, right? People just send me papers all the time, whether that's colleagues or friends of mine who think, oh, I thought of you when I saw this. I think is also a really great way to branch out and keep up with the literature.
Very cool. I love it. Yeah. And the world of literature exploration is growing with AI right now, too. People are using AI now to help them sort through literature and find pieces that kind of fit a current realm they're exploring. So I personally see that growing a lot. We have a couple minutes left. I want to ask just kind of one fun, quick question of you. So you're into chasing storms, you're into scuba diving, top of your bucket list for both. What would be like the best, coolest storm to chase? What would be the coolest place to dive?
Okay. Well, I really have a dream of going to chase like a tornado producing storm somewhere in the high plains in Tornado Alley. It's not something I'm going to do by myself. Like I definitely will defer to experts. It's very risky, very dangerous, but actually even just seeing a tornado is top of my bucket list. And I want to try to make that happen sometime in the next few years. Diving, oh my gosh, my list of diving destinations is huge, but I really want to get into ice diving eventually. And top of my list would be to do that somewhere at the poles. So probably Antarctica, deep below the ice, whether that's the actual Southern Ocean or one of these perennially frozen lakes. Big life goal of mine. So top of bucket list.
I love it. So for all of our viewers watching right now live or in the recorded version later, keep an eye out for Lena's work and her research, as well as on her social media at AstroBioLena. And maybe we'll see some videos of her chasing a tornado and diving under the ice in the very near future. You can also learn more about her at lenavincent.com on her personal website. Dr. Vincent, thank you so much for joining us for the show today.
Thank you. It was a blast.
Yeah, like I said, I wanted you on the show for so long. I've been nerding out over all the cool things you've done and your remarkable research. For those who want to stay in the loop, who are watching right now, you can sign up for the NASA Astrobiology Program's mailing list. That way you get awesome emails about our show, Ask An Astrobiologist, or you can learn more about programs, opportunities, events, research, all the cool things that are going on that are supported through NASA Astrobiology. We loved having you on the show, Dr. Vincent. Thank you so much. To our audience at home who are watching on YouTube or out there in the interwebs somewhere, thank you so much for joining us. So as always, we love you all and stay curious.